In the early days of computing, long before the gaming empires of Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo, a quiet revolution took place, not in Silicon Valley, not in a corporate lab, but in a forgotten corner of tech history, led by a woman whose name you've probably never heard. She didn't have funding. She didn't have a team. What she had was vision, brilliance, and a machine barely more powerful than a calculator. In a world that dismissed her, she built something no one else dared to imagine. The very first video game created by a woman. And then, she vanished from history. No fame, no credit, no legacy. While others rose, she disappeared, buried under decades of silence. This is the untold story of the woman who helped start it all and was forgotten. Her name deserves to be known. And today, we're bringing it back. The story begins in an era when computers didn't fit in your pocket. They filled entire rooms. In the 1940s and 50s, computing was still in its infancy. Machines like the ENIAC and UNIVAC were massive, slow, and intimidating to most. To the outside world, these early computers seemed like magical black boxes. Too complex to understand, too expensive to be useful. And yet, inside these cold, humming machines, history was quietly being rewritten. Back then, hardware was a man's world. Soldering circuits, building mainframes. But programming? That was different. Coding was seen as repetitive, tedious, almost clerical. So it was assigned to women. In fact, some of the world's first programmers were women, like the ENIAC 6, who wrote complex routines without even being allowed to touch the hardware they were coding for. Still, these pioneers rarely received credit, as computers evolved from tools of war to instruments of progress. The narrative shifted, and men took center stage. Women were pushed out of the frame, their contributions gradually erased. By the 1970s, when video games were just starting to emerge, the industry was already becoming a boys' club. The idea of a woman creating a video game from scratch was practically unthinkable. And yet, someone did, against the odds, outside the system, without the recognition. Her story doesn't begin in a boardroom, it begins in silence. And that silence is what we're about to break. Joyce Weisbecker wasn't born into the tech elite. She didn't have venture capital, a development team, or even an audience. What she had was a mind wired for logic and a spark of curiosity that never faded. Born in the United States in the late 1950s, Joyce grew up around machines. Her father, Joseph Weisbecker, was a computer engineer at RCA, a company experimenting with early computing and video display technology. Unlike most daughters in that era, Joyce wasn't discouraged from taking things apart. She was encouraged to explore, to learn. By the time she was a teenager, she was already diving into programming, not on modern PCs, but on homemade computers her father built in their living room. She wasn't trying to be a pioneer. She wasn't chasing fame. She was just a curious kid writing games for fun. In 1976, at just 19 years old, Joyce programmed a series of games for RCA's Cosmac VIP, a computer with no keyboard, no sound, and barely enough memory to hold a page of text. She wrote every line of code by hand, thinking through every logic step like a game of chess. Her first game? Slide, followed by others like TV Schoolhouse I. Simple by today's standards, but revolutionary at the time. But Joyce didn't see herself as part of an industry. She was just solving puzzles and getting paid a modest sum for something no woman had done before. And then she stepped away. No spotlight, no press, no recognition. Not until years later did anyone realize she was the first. In 1976, while most of America was just beginning to understand what a home computer even was, Joyce Weisbecker was already programming games for one. She didn't just play with the technology, she pushed it to its limits. The machine she used was the RCA Cosmac VIP, a small, low-cost computer built around the RCA 1802 microprocessor. It had no sound, no hard drive, and just 2 kilobytes of RAM, barely enough to store a single image file today. And yet, Joyce saw potential where most saw limitations. She began developing games directly on her father's prototypes, using hexadecimal code, not visual interfaces, not simple text-based languages, but raw machine-level input. Every instruction had to be entered as a number. Every bug had to be debugged mentally. There was no real-time feedback, no professional development tools, and still, she built them. Her first known title was Slide, a logic-based game where the player rearranged numbers on a grid, anticipating patterns and planning moves, much like a digital sliding puzzle. It wasn't flashy, but it was clever, and entirely original. Then came TV Schoolhouse I, an educational game that taught math and spelling, inspired by her interest in making learning interactive. It featured on-screen prompts and required the player to select answers with a keypad. In an era when Pong was still a novelty, this was visionary. She also developed games like Jackpot and Speedway, experimenting with mechanics that would later become standard in gaming: scorekeeping, player feedback, and timed responses. What made her work groundbreaking wasn't just the games, it was how she made them. Joyce was essentially a one-person studio, designing, coding, and testing every game alone. She wasn't working in a lab or corporate office. She was creating from her home, using borrowed tools and self-taught logic. Even more remarkably, she was doing this before the modern video game industry had formed. Atari was just getting started. Nintendo was still making playing cards. There was no blueprint, and certainly no female role models in the field. RCA paid her a few $100s for her work. She didn't think much of it at the time. She was a college student, writing code between engineering classes and homework assignments. She never imagined she'd just made history. But she had. Joyce Weisbecker became the first known female video game developer, and one of the first independent developers of any gender. She didn't just play the game, she helped build it. And then, as quietly as she had arrived, she stepped away. Despite her groundbreaking work, Joyce Weisbecker's name never made it into the history books. There were no awards, no interviews, no magazine covers. Her games weren't studied in computer science classes or preserved in tech museums. Why? The answer is a quiet mix of bias, erasure, and timing. In the 1970s, the tech world was becoming more powerful and more male. While early computing had depended on women in programming roles, the rise of the personal computer shifted the spotlight. As software became a business, men increasingly took center stage. Their names were remembered. The women, the coders, the testers, the pioneers faded into the background. Joyce didn't fit the emerging narrative of the tech founder or the game designer. She wasn't building a company. She wasn't pitching to investors. She was a student, programming out of curiosity and personal drive. When RCA decided to exit the home computer market shortly after her games were published, her platform and her work vanished with it. The Cosmac VIP was a commercial failure. And like many early games developed outside the mainstream, hers were never widely distributed or preserved. The media never came knocking. Academics weren't paying attention. And Joyce? She moved on. She went on to earn degrees in engineering and actuarial science. For decades, she never spoke about her early game development. Not out of shame, but because no one ever asked. She didn't chase fame. She didn't try to rewrite history. She let her story fall into silence. Meanwhile, male pioneers of gaming, from Nolan Bushnell to Shigeru Miyamoto, became legends, Joyce remained a footnote, even though her achievements were just as historic. Only years later, as historians and preservationists began digging through old documentation, did her name resurface. They found the code, the listings, the evidence, and they realized the first indie game developer wasn't a man in a garage. It was Joyce Weisbecker, and she had been there all along. For decades, Joyce Weisbecker's story remained buried under layers of forgotten hardware and neglected history. But in recent years, researchers, digital archivists, and retro gaming enthusiasts began piecing together the past. They found her name in dusty RCA documents. They saw her games listed in old manuals. And slowly, the truth emerged. Joyce wasn't just early, she was first. Publications like Fast Company, The Verge, and digital history blogs began highlighting her contributions. Interviews followed. For the first time, she was given the platform she never asked for, but had always deserved. Her rediscovery wasn't just a moment of personal recognition. It challenged the narrative of who builds technology and who gets remembered. While there's no direct lineage from Joyce's games to today's blockbuster titles, her work laid the groundwork for something larger. She proved that games could be made independently, without massive teams or corporate funding, a concept that would later fuel the modern indie game revolution. Today, platforms like Steam, itch.io, and mobile app stores are filled with solo developers, creators making deeply personal games with small budgets and big ideas. Joyce did that in 1976. Her story is now taught in digital history circles. Her games are preserved in archives, and her name is finally rightfully spoken alongside the pioneers of the industry. She didn't build an empire, she built a path, one that reminds us how many stories have gone untold and how many more still need to be heard. Because history isn't just about who was loudest, it's about who was first. And Joyce Weisbecker was first. Joyce Weisbecker's story is just one of many, buried beneath decades of overlooked brilliance, forgotten names, and lost recognition. How many more pioneers were erased simply because they didn't fit the mold? How different would our world be if their contributions had been celebrated, not sidelined? Think about it. If the early gaming industry had acknowledged women like Joyce, would the culture of tech today feel more inclusive? Would innovation have moved faster in a different direction? We may never know, but we do know this. Her legacy matters, not just because she was first, but because she never needed permission to create. What do you think? Would the gaming industry look different today if more women had been credited early on? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if stories like this resonate with you, the hidden chapters of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There's more to uncover, and you won't want to miss it.